All right, so thank you all and welcome to our Governance and Management Research Speaker Series. Today we are fortunate to have two speakers, two co-authors on a research project, assistant professor, still assistant professor, but not for too much longer, I'm told, assistant professor Greg Porumbescu, and then associate professor Suzanne Piotrowski from Rutgers University-Newark. Just as a reminder, we do have one more upcoming speaker, April 23rd, Andrea Headley from the McCourt School at Georgetown University, will be our final speaker for this semester for the Governance and Management faculty group. And for those of you who are in the faculty group, if you have suggestions for people that you do want to invite for our, hopefully what will be in-person speaker series next fall and spring, please let Claudia or myself know about that, and we will start furiously working this summer to try to arrange those visits. So I don't need to spend any time at all talking about our speakers, but just as a quick note, Professor Porumbescu focuses his research on government transparency, and Professor Suzanne Piotrowski, I'm sorry, also does work dealing with sort of open government and the administrative transparency, and both of them work at the Transparency and Governance Center within the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers, and have recently received an NSF grant dealing with trying to work with local government transparency. And so if we have any time to discuss that kind of at the end of the session, I might ask a question or two about that, because it's highly interesting research is being conducted. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our speakers. So thank you.
All right. I can share my screen, I think, and that's what I'll do. Hopefully. All right. So far, it's going off without a hitch. All right. So you should see that.
Looks great.
Okay, great. And I don't want to see you guys. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks, Aaron, for the invitation, and Claudia. It's you know, always pleasant to see everybody. You know, also a little known fact about myself is I was actually born I guess a couple hours up the road in Fort Wayne. So Aaron, you've arranged a sort of virtual homecoming with this talk in a very 2021 way. So yeah, I'm going to be jumping off this to attend the NSF PI meeting that Suzanne had mentioned previously. So you know, by all means, if you'd like to pepper the discussion with questions about that would be great. It will kind of help me switch gears anyway. So the paper I'll present today is forthcoming in J-Part, Performance Information, Racial Bias, and Citizen Evaluations of Government, evidence from two studies. It's by myself, Suzanne, my colleague, and Vincent Mabillard, who's at the Free University of Brussels. So in terms of, I guess, just to provide some background or context for what we're talking about today, we know that, you know, over the past 30 or 40 years, there have been a variety of modernization efforts for public management, for government more broadly. And a lot of these efforts have placed a particular emphasis on improving responsiveness of public bureaucracies, right? Of helping them do a better job in responding to the diverse needs of the communities that they serve. So two very prominent initiatives, trends, reforms in this effort to modernize government include social accountability reforms, right? The idea being to make government more open and accountable to the public. Things like expanding performance information exposure, disclosure, citizen surveys, citizen satisfaction surveys, citizen report cards, virtual town hall meetings. All of these different initiatives fall under this big idea of empowering the public, not only to know what the government is doing, but also to give them more of a say in influencing what the government does. The second big trend or initiative taken in hopes of modernizing governments has been to expand diversity and to push for inclusion in the public workforce. Essentially, the idea here, to make bureaucracies more representative, because we know from a great deal of work that more representative bureaucracies tend to be more responsive to the diverse clientele that they're serving. Here we have initiatives not just to recruit more diverse public sector workers, teachers, and police officers, for example, but also steps that are taken to make sure that once we obtain a more diverse workforce, or we achieve some level of diversity, we're capable of maintaining it, right? Things like diversity and inclusion training. So with this, then, what we're asking in this study, sort of big picture, what we want to look at is whether these efforts to open the public up, open the government up to public input more, might conflict with these efforts to diversify the public sector, right? Is it possible that by opening up the public, the government to public inputs, that the citizens might, or the residents of a community might engage in sort of selective accountability? They might hold certain actors more accountable than others, even when performance is comparable, if not the same. So then what we're doing here, more specifically in the context of this particular study, is asking whether the public will use performance information to hold Black public managers more accountable for a given level of performance than their white peers, right? Is there a racial bias in the link between performance evaluations and accountability? So we break this research objective, this overarching research objective, up into kind of 3 discrete questions. The first being to explore whether organizational performance evaluations vary according to the race of a public manager who's being evaluated, right? Do citizens, does the public evaluate the performance of a Black manager and a performance of a white manager in the same way, or differently, right? Does color matter when we're evaluating performance? The second question is whether any biases, if they do exist, are ironed out by expanding exposure to performance information, or exaggerated by expanding exposure to performance information. What does this additional information do to that bias if it's present in the first place? And then the third question is do preferences to punish poorly performing public managers and support high performing public managers vary according to race? So then, tying this all together, what we're basically asking is whether there are biases in performance evaluation attributable to race, whether there are biases in accountability preferences attributable to race, and how those biases, if they're present, are going to respond to additional information. So before jumping into the theory and outlining the hypothesis, just a couple of key points that deserve some attention. The first is, in this study, what we're looking at is social accountability reforms as a form of treatment discrimination, as opposed to access discrimination. So we're not necessarily focusing on barriers for minoritized communities to enter the public workforce. What we're focusing on is whether these reforms make it more difficult to maintain a diverse workforce once we have some level of diversity that's present. The second point is that we're using 2 studies, as the title indicated, right? And the reason for this is we want to explore how the mechanisms that we're examining in this study play out in contexts of high performance and of low performance. How does accountability function, not just when things are going poorly, but when things go well? And then the third point is that we're focusing on white citizens' use of performance information in the context of this particular study. It helps us isolate some of better assess some of the expectations that I'll discuss in a moment. But there's also a range of work which suggests that white citizens tend to be more active in voicing their opinions in government, and they tend to be more active consumers of performance information. So to move into the theory. So as a starting point, we take occupational stereotype fit theory, which is a mouthful. So occupational stereotype fit theory basically suggests that from a young age, we start to learn to associate certain attributes, physical attributes, with certain professions or occupations. And over time, we develop these baskets of attributes that become the basis for occupational stereotypes, right? So if we conjure up in our mind an image of a truck driver, right, we're going to have certain physical attributes, right? And Google does a nice job illustrating this for me, right? You know, gender is obviously one attribute, stature is another. These are all fairly burly guys. Apparently plaid is an important attribute of being a truck driver. But you know, there's not a lot of diversity in terms of what we're seeing here. You know, same goes for librarians, right? Another fairly gendered profession. And over time then, so the idea is that these baskets of attributes that we associate with occupations become a basis for us evaluating qualifications for a particular profession, right? So the greater the overlap between the attributes, the physical attributes we observe that someone has, and the stereotypes that we've got of this profession, the more qualified we see them as being, right? So the greater the greater someone aligns with the stereotype that we have for a particular occupation, the more qualified, more competent we think they are. So then this leads us to sort of the next question, which is, well, what happens if somebody possesses attributes that diverge from this occupational stereotype that we've developed over time? And what the literature suggests is that when individuals do possess attributes that diverge from this occupational stereotype, we view these individuals as being less qualified for that occupation, right? And I can keep going on with explanations, but sometimes a couple of words in a picture will be way more concise than I ever could, right? You never trust a skinny chef. Why? Because, you know, it diverges with our attributes, with our stereotypes of what chefs look like. So on, I guess, somehow more serious note is that in the United States, studies show that race is an attribute associated with leadership. In particular, being white is seen as being a leadership attribute. So by extension, then this means that minoritized communities, members of minoritized communities are seen as being less qualified for leadership positions. And in particular, what some have shown is that there's a tendency to evaluate Black leaders more negatively than their white peers, even at comparable levels of performance. And it's not just leaders, it's the organizations that they manage. In part here, because it could be that they're perceived as being less qualified for a given position. So this leads us to what some call or term a double standard in leadership. So all of this taken together forms the basis for our first expectation, which is that white members of the public will evaluate the performance of a public organization led by a Black public manager more negatively than public organizations led by a white public manager. There's a racial bias in organizational performance evaluation. So I think the next question is, so if we give individuals more information, so there's a bias. So can we eliminate this bias that's attributable to the use of race as a heuristic by improving exposure or increasing exposure to performance information? Can we drown that heuristic out by improving the information, the quality of information that individuals have to make their decisions? And on the one hand, I think in practice, we see a strong working assumption that we can, right? There are countless initiatives. Governments are often under a lot of pressure to just disclose performance information, to disclose a range of information that they have available. And I think there's also some literature that suggests that this is a useful strategy, at least to some degree, right? Janet Kelly's work, I think it was, I forget the name of the journal, I think it was National Civic Review, perhaps. You know, if you only knew how well your government was performing, you would be very satisfied. So our negative opinions of individuals, of governments, of entities are not so much a function of bias, but rather of a lack of information. On the other hand, what we see from social psychology literature, increasingly behavioral public administration literature, is that it's not really so simple. Actually, giving individuals more information is going to feed into this sort of confirmation bias. It's going to strengthen our existing beliefs, right? So kind of peeling the onion, why, right? So why is it that giving individuals more information might feed into or exaggerate existing evaluation biases or result in even poorer decisions? And one way of explaining this is an outgroup bias, right? So we really like to feel good about ourselves. We also like to feel good about the groups we belong to. We like to see ourselves as superior, and we like to see the groups we belong to as superior. And this bias, in turn, results in selective information processing, right? So when we hear bad things about groups we don't belong to, we listen, because that makes us feel better about the group we belong to. When we hear good things about the groups we belong to, we listen, because that makes us feel better about ourselves. But when we hear bad things about ourselves, we don't listen, because that makes us feel bad about ourselves. And when we hear bad things about other groups, or good things about other groups, we also don't listen, because it questions our superiority, right? So again, you know, the picture puts it in more concise terms than perhaps I am. So then to the second research question about levels of performance information disclosure. You know, can increasing performance information disclosure eliminate any race-based performance evaluation disparities? And I think, as I've just made the case, this is highly unlikely. Individuals are more likely to selectively use performance information to affirm a positive in-group image. And race is a group, unfortunately, that many are using tacitly or explicitly to formulate in-group, out-group opinions. So we have hypothesis 2A, increasing exposure to performance information is going to exaggerate the bias that we predicted in the first hypothesis, such that in context of negative performance, evaluations are going to be much more negative of Black public managers than they are of white public managers. And in the context of positive performance, evaluations of white public managers are going to improve when confronted or when individuals are exposed with more positive information, much more so than they will improve for the Black public manager. So we have a strengthening here, essentially. And I couldn't find any cartoons I felt were suitable for the third research question, so we just, you know, we jump into it. But it's straightforward. So the correlation or the association between performance evaluations and preferences for accountability. Here we can look to work from Hirschman and his, you know, the exit voice loyalty framework. You know, when things are going well, we want to take steps to maintain that status quo, right? We can loyalty, we support people, we reappoint them, we want to make sure that they keep on in the jobs that they're in. But when things aren't going well, we voice opposition, or we sanction individuals, right? We express support for sanctioning or complain. So then what we're also predicting here, given the previous hypotheses, is that the strength of this relationship between performance or organizational performance evaluations and preferences for accountability is going to vary significantly according to the race of the public manager being the race of the public manager who's leading a particular organization. So H3A, greater performance information disclosure, will result in white citizens being more supportive of firing a poorly performing Black public manager than a poorly performing white public manager. And H3B is the opposite for white public managers. White citizens are going to be more supportive of reappointing them when compared to a high-performing Black public manager. So in essence, we also are predicting some sort of bias in terms of the support, the correlation or association between organizational performance evaluations and preferences for accountability attributable to the race of the public manager who's leading a particular organization. So with that, we come to the research design. A little bit about the setting and the background of this study. So we presented participants with a vignette. This is a survey experiment that explained, discussed the performance of roads, the quality of roads in a particular municipality in the Midwest, Renville. And participants were told that there was an independent audit conducted with the support of the public works director to evaluate the quality of roads, and either the city was doing really, really well or really, really poorly. We signaled that this was an independent audit because of work from my colleague Greg Van Ryzen and Oliver James, suggesting that performance information coming from non-governmental sources is seen as being more credible, and therefore, well, it's more credible than performance information coming directly from government itself. Potholes and public works, road quality. We chose this for a couple of reasons. First of all, quality of roads is something that impacts everyone, no matter how you get around. You walk, you bike, you skate, you drive. The quality of roads impacts you. It's also clear how it does so, right? Unlike other service areas where the effects might be a little bit more difficult to detect. And also there's been some research showing that the quality of roads, and in particular potholes, are an especially salient decision point for members of the public when they evaluate the performance of their local governments and they make decisions or develop preferences in terms of holding officials in local government accountable, right? So for these reasons, we've chosen this particular area, Public Works Department and potholes, as the type of performance and performance information we're dealing with. Data, we used, I think it's called Cloud Research now. I believe at the time it was called Turk Prime, which is a platform that allows you to sample participants from Amazon's Mechanical Turk. There's a whole host of interesting discussions to have around quality issues with Amazon's Mechanical Turk and how Cloud Research might mitigate some of those concerns. It's too much to discuss now. Maybe we can chat about it during the question and answer. I know, Aaron, you've used MTurk a bit. So we've got two samples, right? Participants, participants were not randomly assigned to study one or study two. Rather, the studies were run independent of one another. There was no overlap, but there was no random assignment either. So for the high performance experiment, 696 participants. For the low, 695. The results that I'm presenting here, or we are presenting here, are they include all participants. So we included a manipulation check as the final question, one of the final questions in the survey used in this experiment. But we didn't find any substantive differences when we excluded participants who failed the manipulation check, and I didn't really see any reason why we needed to present only those who passed the manipulation check, especially with concerns about conditioning on post-treatment variables. So we're presenting the full sample here, except minus those who failed quality checks. And again, we recruited only white respondents for this particular study. So a word about the variables we're using, starting with manipulated variables. So two treatments, the first, levels of performance information. So for the low exposure condition, we expose them to 2 pieces of performance information. For the high, 6 pieces of information. That's fairly straightforward. The more difficult or more challenging aspect of this experiment was measuring or manipulating perceptions of race or putative race. We used a name-based manipulation, which is not uncommon, but it's also, like so much quantitative work, prone to controversy. So there's a cottage industry around the appropriateness of using name-based manipulations. Much of the concern here relates to the correlation or association between names, perceptions of race, and socioeconomic attributes. So in other words, if we're using a name-based treatment, how can we be sure that it's the perception of race that's explaining the results and not something else like education or another feature that's also associated with race? Our treatment effects are not biased. So we got to that by including, we addressed that by including background information, right? So it seems like a fairly straightforward approach to dealing with this concern. We explained to participants, all participants, that the Director of Public Works, here we did not use a name. The Director of Public Works was born and raised in the city of Renville and attended Renville Community College. So we touch on the qualifications of the individual, the educational background, and also give some hints about the family background of the individual, to sort of create a common baseline such that the only deviations from that common baseline then might be perceptions of race and little else. In terms of the specific names that we chose, Deshaun Jackson, Deshaun being one of the most common African-American first names in the United States, Jackson being one of the most common African-American last names. The same goes for Jake Mueller, only for white people. Outcomes. So for organizational performance evaluations, these are fairly straightforward. How would you rate the performance of the Department of Public Works? A sliding scale of 0 to 100. And then for outcomes, the second outcome, to what extent do you support a decision to fire, or in the case of positive performance, reappoint the Director of Public Works? So the outcomes here, a bit stylized, but the best I think we could do. So this is just a look at what the treatments, how the treatments were. So the key point here is we wanted the word count to be balanced right across the different vignettes, which can be tricky when you're dealing with low performance information exposure versus high performance information exposure. We wanted to make sure that we were avoiding sort of this length is strength problem that might bias our findings. So we included neutral text in the low performance information treatment condition, which just discussed hours of operation. That's the way we worked around that. Findings. So we've got hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 here. I'll start with study 1 on the left panel. So first, in terms of hypothesis 1, we don't find any main effect of putative race or perceived race on organizational performance evaluations. This is to say that performance evaluations, when controlling for levels of performance information disclosure, didn't vary according to the race of the public manager leading the particular organization. So a bit of good news. On the other hand, that's where the good news stops. So what we see is by expanding exposure to performance information, we're actually increasing bias. We're activating this bias. So it's a bit different than what I was discussing earlier. The idea earlier being that by expanding exposure to performance information, we iron out disparities. But actually what we're finding here is that by expanding exposure to performance information, we're creating disparities, right? Specifically on the left hand, the two left-hand columns there, we see that by exposing individuals to more performance information, this results in a significant drop in terms of how positively the organization was evaluated, or how negatively, in this case, the organization was evaluated. But we don't see the same type of drop for the white public manager, right? Now, I think it's also important to note here that these aren't dramatic differences. These are subtle differences. This effect is statistically significant for the Black public manager. The effect of additional information on performance evaluations for the white public manager is not statistically significant. But is that enough, for us to draw big conclusions of bias? We don't find that the differences in effects themselves is statistically significant. That difference is statistically significant. So what we tried to do here what we wanted to do was ask ourselves, are these differences that we're observing here, the statistically significant difference in particular for the Black public manager condition attributable to increased exposure to performance information, is that just noise? Or is that a real effect? So we've ran, and you can, this is available in the supplementary materials for the article. We sort of tried to break the effect, right? So we ran different control variables. We looked at it for people who passed the manipulation check, people who didn't pass the manipulation check. And then we also took a slightly different approach, and we used Bayesian equivalence testing, right? To really examine the quality of evidence that we're using to inform the conclusions that we're trying to draw here. And across all these different tools that we're using, we see us, we find basically that there is bias for the Black public manager, and there is no evidence of any bias for the white public manager, right? So taken together, what I'm trying to say here is that there is a bias, and I'm fairly confident that it exists. It's just a very, very subtle bias. Does that mean it's trivial? No, I think these types of bias are particularly important because they're the ones that are hard to identify, but also matter over time. So for study 2, we see nothing. A much easier, much better explanation. When things are going well, nobody really cares. When we expand performance information, when we have low performance information exposure, it doesn't matter. White public manager, Black public manager, not a huge difference. Now, it's also worth noting that these findings, while we didn't necessarily anticipate this, it very much maps onto much of the performance information literature discussing a negativity bias in the way that we respond to government performance, right? When things are bad, we tend to care a lot. And in particular, what we're showing is that when things are bad and you're Black, apparently the public cares a lot more, right? When things are going well, great, but it's not such a salient point. It doesn't evoke such performance information, doesn't evoke very sharp opinions. So for the third hypothesis, so again, starting with study 1 on the left hand, this is looking at the association between organizational performance evaluations and preferences to fire the public manager. We see a negative correlation. So the more poorly we evaluate, the more poorly the organizational performance was evaluated, the stronger the preference to fire the public manager was. What we also see is that the size of this coefficient for the Black public manager is nearly 1.5 times what it is for the white public manager, right? Which leads us to the next question, which is, well, is that evidence of statistically significant variation in terms of the coefficient sizes? I'll let you be the judge of that, right? 0.052. I think, in this case, especially given the sensitive material that we're dealing with, this merits further investigation. It's enough to act on. For study 2, in the high performance context, again, we don't really see much variation attributable to race. We find a positive association between organizational performance evaluations and support for reappointing the public manager, and no significant variation in terms of the size of the coefficients attributable to the public manager piece. So then in hypothesis 3, basically what we're showing is that preferences to fire poorly performing public managers are stronger, they're there, preferences for accountability are there in context of poor performance, and they're really strong if you're Black. They're much weaker if you're white. Digging deeper now, what we want to do is we want to look at all of this together, right? We want to put these different pieces of the puzzle together and see them in the same picture. So we're looking at essentially indirect effects, mediation. So what this means then is we're looking at the effect of increased performance information exposure on preferences in study 1, preferences to fire the public manager, and to what extent any effect that we do detect is attributable to organizational performance evaluations. What we find here is that for the Black public manager, there is a significant indirect effect. So flipping from low performance information exposure to high performance information exposure increased preferences to fire the Black public manager because of this negative impact it had on organizational performance evaluations. In other words, people wanted to fire the Black public manager more because they felt they were doing a poor job in managing the organization. Wasn't the case for the white public manager, however. And you'll also see that the coefficient size on these indirect effects is very different, right? So the Black public manager condition is statistically significantly larger than it is for the white public manager. So again, here we pick up another piece of evidence of racial bias in terms of responses to performance information. Study 2 is a little bit different. What we find here is almost the opposite, right? So No indirect effects. Nobody wanted to reappoint the Black or white public manager because of how well they were performing. What we do see, however, is that shifting from low performance information exposure to high performance information exposure increased preferences to reappoint the white public manager for reasons other than organizational performance, how well they were doing in managing the organization, right? So there's something else there. And we don't see that for the Black public manager. So in study 2, essentially, we're picking up an additional unexpected piece of evidence of racial bias in performance information processing, but this particular piece of racial bias is not attributable to organizational performance evaluations, right? There's some other mechanism that we don't have any clear idea on what it is that's explaining this. I'm going to skip that because I should have separated this into two slides, but I didn't, so I'm going to skip it. Okay, so we can just kind of finish out with some conclusions or implications. I think the first is that what we show is sort of aligns with a growing body of literature demonstrating that individuals, members of the public, are selective in the way that they're using performance information to evaluate performance and hold public actors accountable for their performance. There's a lot of research that has looked at this through a lens of partisanship and political ideology. But in public administration, at least to my knowledge, there's been very little, if not any, research that has sort of explored this through a lens of race. And what we see is pretty clear evidence that the sample that we're using, the white sample that we've used, these individuals exhibit a strong preference to punish Black public managers when they perform poorly. But when they're doing well, there isn't that same type of sensitivity to greater performance information, right? So once again, when things are going poorly, there's more sensitivity to performance information, and that sensitivity is especially pronounced if you're a Black public manager. Increasing exposure to performance information, in this sense, might actually embolden or activate these racial biases and biases more generally. We know from research, I think it was by Martin Becker, as well as a couple of others, in exploring other types of bias, that this is the case, right? Increasing exposure to performance information sort of gives individuals the confidence they have, the confidence they need to act on these tacit biases. And we're contributing to this picture again by showing that it's not just things like partisan ideology or political bias, but also racial bias that factors in here. This in turn leads us to kind of a bigger picture issue, which is a tension between equality and openness, right? These efforts to expand transparency, to incorporate citizen feedback into government evaluation processes, run the risk of empowering some groups of the population at the expense of others, right? It empowers some to make government more responsive to them, some groups to make government more responsive to them, and that will come at the expense of government responsiveness to other entities. This is, of course, there's a subsequent risk then, which is that through the use of social accountability reforms, we might, we run the risk of democratically legitimizing race-based disparities, right? It might very well be that at least in certain circumstances and certain ways of applying social accountability reforms, they serve as a source of institutional racism. So these are fairly, it's not a very optimistic picture. These are significant challenges that I think governments need to confront if they're to effectively use transparency and accountability, which I think they have to, in a way that doesn't jeopardize efforts to build more representative public institutions. Now, I guess in light of all this sort of negativity bias, negative performance, lots of negatives and performance, but a more, to close on an optimistic note, it's not all bad news here, right? Because what we've showed also in this study is that while there is a subtle bias and it manifests itself in different ways to disadvantage Black public managers, at some level of disclosure, that bias isn't present, right? So then this isn't to say that governments should be careful in how much information they're disclosing, but rather that if governments are more thoughtful about the way that they're being transparent, it might be possible to navigate these tensions between equality and openness, and efforts to become more diverse. Yeah, I guess that concludes my presentation. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Greg. Claudia had a quick question before she has to hop off. I think, do you want to ask her or do you want me to?
Sure, I will ask. So Greg, thank you very much, and Suzanne for the presentation. Did you find any differences in responses across the gender and age of respondents?
No, and we also looked for, it's a great question, we also looked at political identity, right, partisan affiliation. We didn't really pick up much, right, which was interesting. I mean, I mentioned this earlier, issues with Mechanical Turk and the sample pool, we're pooling from there. It might be that using a more diverse sample, right, we might pick up on some of those differences. But yeah, I mean, we didn't pick up anything substantive there. And the more surprising piece here was as it relates to party affiliation, right? Because that also didn't really appear to play into the decision or the evaluation process.
What was the proportion of women within the respondents?
Okay, that's a specific question. I don't have the data. If memory serves, it was something to the, I think it was almost equivalent. There might have been a couple more women than men. Responses from Mechanical Turk tend to trend high on women. But there wasn't a marked disparity, if memory serves.
Thank you, Greg. Bye-bye.
All right,
Thanks, Claudia.
Jill and Sean have a hand raised.
Hey, Greg, thank you. Great paper, and I see Suzanne's signed off, but thank you both for coming to present. This was really enjoyable. A couple of questions. Was the manipulation check, did more people get it right in the high information group? Okay.
Yeah.
That seems to me something really to investigate, right? Do I dig in and start caring about manager race or manager characteristics once I'm cued in that I should be paying attention to the details of performance?
Yeah. So it was surprising. So the number that failed was markedly different. Again, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I probably should have had that table. It's in the supplementary material, but it was markedly different. And at first it took us a little bit of time. It's funny that this was like the first comment from you. I wonder if you have your own experiences with this, but yeah, I think there could be a social desirability bias, right? Once they're cued into this, they're a little bit more cautious. It also, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think there is a lot to go on there. Probably I know I would need much larger samples, but it's definitely an interesting phenomenon, at least within the context of this study.
Related to that, Greg, could you clarify what the test was for the
Manipulation check?
yeah.
We asked them what race they thought the public manager they read about was.
And the results were?
I don't have that table in front of me, but I want to say that for the high performance, I mean, all of this is available online, right? So it's all there, but I want to say, like, for the negative performance, it was something like 30% failed, and maybe 10. I mean, it was a really surprising number. But the more surprising thing was that.
But what does it mean to fail?
They chose a race other than the one that they were assigned to. So if I were assigned to Deshaun Jackson, I would say that he was white or Native American or something like that. But the sort of the surprising thing here is how robust the effects are. So we ran this with those who only passed the manipulation checks, et cetera. And we didn't, I don't recall any major differences in the findings.
Greg, the second question I had was, I quickly glimpsed the treatment. Was it all historical information or was any of it social in terms of the performance, social comparison versus historical?
There were elements of both, I believe.
Okay.
So I think it said that the roads are now the worst in the state.
Okay. I was just curious if you guys had run a social, given sort of the evidence that people respond more robustly to social information or social comparisons. Maybe some of your race effect isn't being muted by the fact that they may not care that much about historical, or judging a Black manager against themselves is different than judging a Black manager against a white manager in the town next door who's not doing as well. I mean, I don't know it would turn out that way, but it seems like an interesting, again, source of variation you guys could explore.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I like that feedback. It is interesting. I don't think we explicitly thought about it that way when we did. I mean, the manipulations were designed probably 2 or 3 years ago, so it's not at the top of my mind. But I don't think we thought about it along those lines, and I think that's a great comment. That's interesting to consider also going forward.
Well, thanks again. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
All right, who else has questions? Got a couple hands up.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
My question is like related to Sean's question. So maybe I've covered this, but I missed it. So one treatment is like the quantity of the performance information, like 2 pieces versus 6 pieces. So could you like specify what are those 2 pieces and 6 pieces performance information in the experiment?
Yeah, let me see if I can find out how to go back. I know how to go forward. Okay. So average, yeah, so we had a couple of pieces of information. So one was sort of an absolute response, right? So just on the left-hand panel, right, it's failed to meet performance objectives and the roads are the worst in the state. And here we elaborate on what that means a bit, right? So we give particulars, right? So the number of potholes has doubled, the time to repair them has increased, the average cost to repair them has doubled, and some consequences of the poor performance in terms of street maintenance.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
The questions, Daniel?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So I only caught the last 7 minutes or so here, so I really apologize. But I had a question whether you or why you chose to only look at a sample of white participants. And I guess, sorry, so the reason I'm asking it is just, let's say that you did it for white and Black participants and you found sort of symmetric results or didn't find symmetric results. I guess I'm wondering about sort of how we should interpret, how would we interpret the results kind of under those, or different possible scenarios, whatever.
Yeah, so, I mean, this was actually one of the more, it was a complicated decision. I guess that's the most concise way of putting it. So I think I wasn't entirely, so first of all, there was a budget constraint. So I wasn't entirely convinced that if we were recruiting African-Americans or Black participants who identified on MTurk as Black, that they would all be Black necessarily, because certain hits go to certain, that target certain communities, and the more communities you identify with, the more money you can qualify to make, right? So I would have greater confidence if we were using something like Qualtrics, but I just didn't have the money to do that. So to the point about whether to use a mixed sample or to focus solely on white participants, the theory that we're sort of working on is in-group, out-group biases. So it just mapped on a little bit more cleanly as a test of out-group, in-group, out-group biases to use a sample of only white participants. But to your point, right? So, and this, I don't want to make it sound overly dramatic, but it was an agonizing decision. We knew we needed 2 studies. We didn't know in what that second study should be. Did we want to test this mechanism in context of high performance and low performance, or did we want to test this mechanism in samples of white citizens and Black citizens? We made the tough call and did one, but not, so that was it. But to your point, I mean, it is super interesting to explore this using more diverse samples, but also using samples solely of Black participants. I know that there have been a couple of studies in the general management literature that has done this. So it's definitely an avenue worth considering for future research down the line.
Can I ask one really quick follow-up comment, sort of half question, half comment? I don't know if someone said this to you or if you've thought about this since then or whatever, but the name Deshaun Jackson is sort of a complicated choice, I think, because that's also the name of a professional football player, a well-known professional football player, a Black professional football player, and a Black professional football player who, it was a couple of years ago now, I think, got himself in some hot water on social media for some anti-Semitic comments. So too late now, but maybe, something to keep in mind if you're ever thinking about doing something like this again. So
yeah, I mean, it's tricky to come up with sort of, I guess that, so I discussed this earlier in the presentation. It's tricky to manipulate names because you never know exactly what you're manipulating, right? So to your point, like I thought I was being clever by putting background information about, where they're born and how they're being educated. But then it turns out that there's a guy who might be an anti-Semite on Twitter. And I didn't rule that out, but again, this is part of the challenge with using name-based manipulations, is that it's really difficult to iron out all these differences, save perceptions of race.
Great. Other questions?
What about other sorts of experiments? This is a survey experiment. If I lived in Renville, I would know who's white and who's Black. And I'm just wondering whether, for instance, there's research on the anonymity in negotiations having a significant consequence in decision making. So this is anonymous. The question is, in the real world, would there be the similar anonymity? When I worked in Two Rivers, Wisconsin on the flusher, everybody knew who was working on the flusher and saw me regularly going up and down the streets. And they knew my race, and I probably knew theirs. But I'm wondering whether we sort of move this out of the survey experiment context, whether we would get similar results.
Yeah, I mean, I like that comment a lot. This was also a discussion that we had. It would be really nice to get some actual, this is real data, but real data that comes from an actual performance context. I just didn't have the time to do it, but I agree. It would be interesting to see whether these findings map onto real life scenarios. There was this really interesting study by Antonakis, right?
Yeah, John.
Yeah, John Antonakis, and I forget who the other author is. And I think it was about football coaches.
Leadership.
Yeah, do you know the one I'm talking about, Jim?
No, not precisely, but I know John's work, and he's editor for the Leadership Quarterly.
Yeah. So I think their study also picked up on a racial bias, either with using real world. So they had I think it's an Academy of Management. They paired a survey experiment with some actual observational data, and did demonstrate that there was, at least in I think it was football coaches and CEOs or something, a racial bias in performance evaluation. And it's like a super sophisticated paper. But it'd be great to do.
I mean, there's a prospect that things could be worse when whites are evaluating Blacks in the particular context, or vice versa, for instance. So, this it may be borne out in the real world, but it may even be worse than what you discovered, because there's no there's no error in sort of guessing race and the like.
Well, and I think that's sort of one of the interesting things to consider especially using the sample that we're using, right? Is that in general, the folks in this sample are going to be more affluent. They're going to be, Mechanical Turk. It's all online. They're going to be more affluent. They're more technologically savvy. They're better educated. So there's a couple of reasons to believe that there might be, any racial animus is going to be less pronounced in this group than it might be in a more representative sample of the U.S. population, or in a representative sample of the white U.S. population. So I agree. I mean, I totally agree, Jim.
Greg, let me jump in there with a question related to this, if you don't mind. Jim's talking about moving the experiment into the real world. I actually would be more interested in what would happen if you would run this experiment with the manager or the administrator at a higher level of authority in the organization, to see if in other words, if this were the city manager instead of what's essentially a middle management position, if you would detect a stronger signal there. And I think that might tie back to sort of the study you were just referencing, where it's talking about Black CEOs or people that are at the top of the hierarchy being and essentially, perhaps more racial discrimination targeted at them if they're at the top of the organization. Do you think that's likely or a bad idea, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume it'd be more pronounced, right? I mean, if the theory that we're testing, I mean, of the insights that were, occupational stereotype fit theory, right? So the more leadership, I guess, responsibilities that an individual has, the more important that leadership stereotype is going to be in evaluating the performance of that individual, right? So a middle manager is not going to have the same type of leadership responsibilities that a city manager or the president of the United States is going to have, for example. So if the theory sort of progresses in the way we might expect, then I think it would certainly make sense to find that the results would become even stronger when you move up the chain of command.
Okay, good. Daniel's got another question.
So I think I understood what you were saying at the start of the Q&A about the manipulation check. So if I understood right, you were saying that there were about 30% of cases where people thought Deshaun Jackson was white rather than Black, or vice versa for the other guy. Is that right?
Yeah, they stated, right? So, yeah.
And did you compare the results, did you say, for the group that failed versus didn't fail their performance check?
Yeah, so we didn't find any differences. I mean, again, I probably should have had some appendices here with those analysis. They're online, but there weren't differences that tore apart the results, right? There was nothing that you would, there was nothing to call into question the findings, the main findings of this paper.
But I guess I'm curious how to interpret that, right? So if the mechanism is race, but then the group that gets the race wrong responds in the same way as the group that gets the race right,
yeah,
it seems hard to me, that would not square with the notion that it's about race. I mean, and I agree, I'm not trying to push too hard on that, but it is, at least to me, that would not be the exhibit that I would use to say, look, this shows that the mechanism here is race or discrimination or racism, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and feel free to push. Like it's fine. I mean, this is what steel cuts steel. That's how we have good ideas. So don't worry about it. But yeah, I mean, so this is it's a tricky conversation, right? Because on the one hand, if we have like 30%, so okay, so and again, I'm pulling numbers out. We'll say 30%. It could have been more or less. So let's say 30% in the negative performance information study failed the manipulation check. Surprisingly, far fewer failed the manipulation check in the positive performance information study, right? So that was sort of interpreted as potential evidence of a social desirability response. So once, as Sean had mentioned before he dropped off, by cluing in respondents that this was about race and not something else, they suddenly became less willing to almost admit that they knew this was about race, that they knew the person they were evaluating was an African American, and that they were evaluating that individual negatively. So it's sort of like, oh, they caught me. Wait, I'm not really racist. or I'm not really racially biased in the way I'm interpreting this information.
So you're saying that they were purposely, I just want to make sure I understand, you're saying that that might be evidence that they were kind of purposely failing the manipulation check?
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
No, I was just making sure I understood.
Yeah, that's fine. And I think this also kind of maps onto broader discussions about, conditioning on post-treatment variables as well, right? Like, there's clearly something there. There's clearly a reason why these people, why a certain group of people decided to, or maybe they didn't decide. There's clearly a reason why a certain group of people failed the manipulation check, right? And I think it's truer to the results to present them in their entirety rather than just to focus on those who passed the manipulation check, because we can't say for certain why they failed the manipulation check.
Great. We got any other questions? Daniel, do you have any other questions?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, I have a question if nobody else is raising their hands. Greg, since we got you for a few more minutes before you hop onto your meeting, one thing I'm struggling with the paper and how to make sense of it is how to situate, sort of in-group, out-group bias or occupational stereotype bias within the larger sort of negativity bias when we're thinking about specifically how people view government, because we see negativity bias in terms of government performance show up, in all kinds of studies. And if we're doing research on negativity bias, do you feel like, that a component of that's something that needs to be unpacked is the racial element, for example? Or do you think that, for example, these are part and parcel to a similar mechanism? Because when I think about negativity bias, I think about, the textbook sort of definition of, overweighting a negative experience that someone has had, even if the vast majority of their experiences with a particular agency have been positive. They overweight that one negative experience and then evaluate that organization based off that negative experience. With racial bias, I tend to think of this as stereotype based and maybe not necessarily something that that is premised on having a negative experience with someone in an out group. But maybe it is. But maybe how do you kind of square negativity bias with research like this on racial bias? Do they need to square?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, that's an interesting question. And I don't know that the study was designed to test that.
Sure.
But I think that's what makes it, that's what makes this an interesting conversation, is that I'm not really prepared to have it. So I mean, I think, so taking a really big picture sort of perspective on this, we look the arc of history, right? When times are bad, we really tend to take it out on individuals we see as being dissimilar to ourselves. And I think if history is any indicator, what we might expect is that for these negative, in context of negative performance, we might see race as being a moderator, right? And I think that would be one way to square it, is that these negative, if I'm understanding the question correctly as well. So in circumstances where there's poor performance, it's bad for everybody, but it's especially bad if you belong to certain minoritized groups, such as African American or Black or Latinx or and now, as we're seeing, Asian Americans are. I think I just saw a recent study out. Asian residents of the U.S. It's economic anxiety, right? That's leading to all these racist, these awful attacks on Asian residents. So when things are going bad, everybody's upset. It affects everybody, but then people start to attribute blame to out-group actors and members of groups that look dissimilar from ourselves.
Okay, so you're situating it potentially with, at least that's what the study seems to suggest. You're situating it within a broader latent mechanism of negativity bias.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're not manipulating that,
right?
But that it's there was no random assignment to study 1 or study 2. So we're it's not a manipulated variable in this. So we're speculating here entirely.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, other questions? A few students on. Does anybody want to throw in a question? Seeing none. All right. Well, then, Greg, we will go ahead and let you go a few minutes early. Thank you. Thank you very much for the time. And please extend our thanks again to Suzanne. Sorry, this is overlapped with a lot of ASPA sort of events. And so folks have had to duck in and out. But
ASPA, yeah.
really appreciate you coming on. It was recorded. And so far, the traffic for these increases exponentially when they are asynchronous. So your presentation will travel wide and far once we get it online, I'm sure.
Right. That's great. Well,
Thanks, Greg.
everybody. Yeah, thanks, Jim. Good to see you.
Good to
Hopefully
see
I'll be
you.
in person someday.
All right, thank you. And Greg, I want to talk to you offline.